used to it. I mean, it's like even that question is almost like you haven't been in a good bear market before, or you haven't been in. I mean,
most people haven't.
Okay, well, history, understanding the history and the mechanics of what it's like, understanding when you produce a lot of money in debt, then how do you produce, then you have tightener money, understanding what does it mean tighter money, understand the consequences of these things. You have to have a historical perspective, I think.
If somebody said to you, okay, we are clearly moving into a bear market, how long do you think it will last?
I think that the Fed's trade-off between inflation and growth, it always tries to see a balance. And there are some times when conditions are good, usually when there's not much debt, that trade-off is not difficult to run. We're entering a period of time where there's an great inflationary pressure due to the fact that you produce so much money and at the same time they're trying to strike that balance of the tightening of monetary policy. So it looks to me like an environment like a stagflation kind of environment where both will be a particular challenge. So individuals have got to know, what does that mean? For example, interest rates and debt instruments that they're holding will not have a real return. They have that's adequate. In other words, not enough earnings to compensate for inflation. Last year we had an inflation rate of about 8%. There's a zero earnings. So if people start to think in terms of buying power and realize that cash instruments and debt instruments are going to be a challenge and try to diversify their portfolios, those would be the main headlines that I'd convey in terms of don't just look at up and down in bull markets and bear markets. Look at diversification and be very particularly worried about whether the real returns that you're going to get on your cash or your bonds. I think too many people are not worried about that kind of environment. If you even study the 70s or other periods of time like that, that would be helpful.
China continues with its lockdown. Even the WHO now says this is not sustainable, but they continue with it. And that has effects hugely beyond the Chinese borders.
Of course.
Is that a concern for you?
Of course, of course. The United States imports 22% of its imports of manufactured goods come from China. That's a lot. I mean, there's a big dependence. And so it's part of the world economy. The war in the Ukraine with Russia, these things are, again, they repeat in history. You see them happen in history. But each one of them, and then the expenses that we're going to have, the cost of the environment. There's two sides. The cost of not fixing it and the cost of fixing it. They're both expensive.
Where do you stand?
Well, you have to. The cost of not dealing with this is catastrophic.
Finally, when Christine Lagarde said to me at the IMF last month, she said, we are witnessing basically not just a new global order, but the unwinding of globalization. We are witnessing a entirely new structure of which we do not know what it looks like yet. But would you agree with her?
Yes,
and how
but
risky
if you study the 1930 to 45 period, and you study a number of periods before that, that all happened when these three things align. There's a lot of debt, not enough money. There's internal conflict. What does that mean for our elections and how we're going to be with each other? There's the external conflict. It's very, very classic, for example, to have, when you have a war-like environment, particularly right before the wars, to be that way with each other. And so it shows in history. Yes, you're going to have a different environment in which the ideologies are going to be in war, and the ideologies are going to drive who gets what.
Does it have a happy ending?
The likely, let me give you the short term and the long term. We have the capacity to have the best living standards that we have had if we can work well with each other. The world is richer than it is. It's been more inventive. Life expectancy is greater and so on. The capacity to be inventive if we can be harmonious, if we can work well together, there's a great capacity to do things. What is the likelihood of that?
Yes.
That's the question?
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, it's not. If you read history and you look at what's happening, it's going to be more difficult before it gets better. You go through these periods last a number of years, a few years, sometimes 5 years, sometimes longer, and you go through them, and then man gets past it, and then, like after a war, but it is very, very dangerous. So I'm worried.